7:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Ensign Joseph Taussig Jr. stood on the deck of USS Nevada, coffee cup in hand, watching what he thought was a routine Sunday morning drill. Then he saw the splash. A torpedo wake, cutting through the crystalline water of the harbor, heading straight for Battleship Row. His coffee hit the deck. "Impossible!" he shouted to no one in particular. "Torpedoes can't work here." He was right to think so. Every naval expert in the world agreed. Pearl Harbor's waters were too shallow. The math was simple, the physics undeniable. Aerial torpedoes needed 75 to 100 feet of depth to avoid hitting bottom. Pearl Harbor averaged 40 feet. It was torpedo-proof. The US Navy had bet everything on that assumption. The Japanese had bet everything on proving them wrong. Within 12 minutes, USS Oklahoma would roll over, trapping over 400 men inside her hull. Within 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet would lie in ruins. And American naval engineers would be asking the same question Ensign Taussig asked in those first seconds of horror. How did Japan achieve the impossible? The answer would be found in wooden fins, obsessive Japanese engineering, and the deadliest underestimation in American military history. To understand what made Pearl Harbor such a shock, you have to understand what every naval power in 1941 believed about torpedoes. The aerial torpedo was the most devastating ship killer ever invented. Dropped from aircraft, these weapons could punch holes below a warship's waterline, where armor was weakest, where flooding was catastrophic. A single torpedo could cripple a battleship. 3 or 4 could sink one. But they had one critical limitation: depth. When a torpedo drops from an aircraft at altitude and speed, it doesn't glide gracefully into the water. It plunges. The standard Mark 13 torpedo, used by American forces, would dive to depths of 75 to 100 feet before leveling out. In shallow water, that meant disaster. The torpedo would either bury itself in the mud or porpoise back to the surface. Its gyroscope smashed, its warhead useless. This wasn't theory. This was physics. Every navy in the world operated under the same constraints. You simply could not conduct a successful aerial torpedo attack in shallow harbor waters. Pearl Harbor's average depth was 40 to 45 feet. In some areas, it was even shallower. American war planners looked at those numbers and smiled. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, had been briefed on Pearl Harbor's natural defenses. The narrow entrance could be netted. The shallow waters made submarine attacks difficult. And aerial torpedo attacks impossible. A 1941 US Navy intelligence assessment stated it clearly. Pearl Harbor is not vulnerable to torpedo attack due to insufficient water depth. Enemy planning should focus on this assumption. They were so confident they didn't even deploy torpedo nets around Battleship Row. Why waste resources on an impossible threat? The British had provided a warning. On November 11, 1940, Royal Navy Swordfish biplanes attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto harbour in southern Italy. Taranto's waters were shallow, 42 to 50 feet in most areas. The British had modified their torpedoes to run shallow. They sank 3 Italian battleships in a single night. American observers studied the Taranto raid. Their conclusion: interesting but not applicable. The Mediterranean was different from the Pacific. Italian defences were weak. The British got lucky. Such an attack couldn't work against a prepared, defended American base. They filed the report and forgot about it. The Japanese did not forget. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity. He knew that in a prolonged war, Japan would be crushed under the weight of American production. Japan's only chance was a knockout blow. A surprise attack so devastating that the US Navy would be crippled for years, giving Japan time to fortify its Pacific conquests and create an impregnable defensive perimeter. The target was obvious: Pearl Harbor. The American Pacific Fleet, conveniently concentrated in one location, 7 battleships and an aircraft carrier, sitting in neat rows. But there was that problem. That impossible problem. In early 1940, Yamamoto called a meeting of his top aviation and torpedo experts. His directive was simple and terrifying. Make aerial torpedoes work in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. Daxavan in the common owner have a problem, something the Benning N into 7. No excuses. No alternatives. Make it work, or the entire plan fails. The experts protested. It violated the laws of physics. The torpedoes would hit bottom. The attack would fail. Yamamoto's response became legendary in Japanese naval circles, then changed the physics. What followed was one of the most intensive weapons development programs of the pre-war period, conducted in absolute secrecy at Kagoshima Bay on Japan's southern coast. Kagoshima's waters were similar in depth to Pearl Harbor, making it the perfect testing ground. The Japanese had advantages the Americans didn't appreciate. Their Type 91 aerial torpedo was already superior in some respects, with better gyroscopic stabilization and more reliable detonators. But making it work in 40 feet of water required innovations that bordered on revolutionary. Hundreds of test drops were conducted. Pilots flew at suicidally low altitudes. Engineers adjusted angles, speeds, and weights. Failure after failure. Torpedoes buried in mud. Warheads broke off. Gyroscopes shattered. The costs were mounting. Training casualties increased as pilots pushed the limits. Several aircraft crashed during low-altitude drops. The program consumed resources Japan could barely afford. But slowly, impossibly, they made progress. By September 1941, Japanese engineers believed they had a solution. It wasn't one modification. It was a complete system redesign, requiring perfect coordination between aircraft performance and torpedo technology. The secret was about to be tested on a scale that would change history. American intelligence knew the Japanese were training intensively. Radio intercepts showed unusual activity around Kagoshima Bay, but analysts assumed it was standard carrier training. After all, what could they be practicing that would threaten Pearl Harbor? Torpedoes don't work in shallow water. Everyone knew that. The Japanese solution was elegant, ingenious, and so simple that American engineers would later kick themselves for not thinking of it first. The breakthrough centered on the Type 91 Model 2 torpedo, a weapon that would become infamous in naval history. The standard version was already formidable. 17.7 feet long, 17.7 inches in diameter, carrying a 450-pound warhead. Its oxygen-enriched engine could push it at 42 knots for over 2 miles. But none of that mattered if it hit bottom before arming. The problem was the dive. When an aerial torpedo hits water at speed, momentum carries it downward. The heavier the torpedo, the faster it drops, the deeper it dives. Standard procedure required aircraft to drop from at least 300 feet altitude at speeds around 250 knots. Under these conditions, torpedoes would plunge to 75 feet or more before their control surfaces could level them out. The Japanese needed their torpedoes to dive no more than 35 feet. The primary innovation was deceptively simple: wooden stabilizer fins. Japanese engineers fabricated breakaway stabilizer fins from carefully selected Japanese cypress wood. These fins, roughly rectangular and surprisingly large, were attached to the torpedo's tail section with precisely calculated breakaway pins. Here's how it worked. The wooden fins increased the torpedo's surface area dramatically, creating much more drag when it hit the water. This drag slowed the torpedo's descent, preventing the deep dive that would normally occur. The fins also improved the torpedo's attitude on entry, keeping it more horizontal. Then, once the torpedo was in the water and its speed had dropped to operational levels, water pressure and the torpedo's own engine thrust would break the wooden pins. The fins would separate and float away, leaving the torpedo free to run true with its normal control surfaces. The wood choice was critical. Too light, and the fins wouldn't provide enough stability. Too heavy, and they wouldn't break away cleanly. Japanese cypress proved ideal, its density and grain structure providing the perfect balance of strength and controlled failure. But the wooden fins were only part of the solution. The Japanese had to completely redesign their attack profile. Standard torpedo bomber tactics were thrown out. Everything had to change. Drop altitude was reduced from 300 feet to just 40 to 60 feet above the water. This was insanely dangerous. At that altitude, there was no room for error. A slight miscalculation, a moment of turbulence, and the aircraft would hit the water. Drop speed had to be reduced to 160 to 180 knots, much slower than normal torpedo runs. This made the aircraft more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, turning them into slow-moving targets during the most critical seconds of the attack. The torpedoes themselves received additional modifications. Engineers adjusted the gyroscope mechanisms to compensate for the unusual entry dynamics. They added anti-roll devices to keep the torpedo running level after the wooden fins separated. They fine-tuned the depth settings to keep the weapons running at just 10 to 12 feet below the surface. The testing phase was brutal. At Kagoshima Bay, pilots made hundreds of practice runs through the fall of 1941. Each drop was measured, analysed, adjusted. Engineers stood in boats, timing dives with stopwatches, measuring angles, calculating trajectories. Early tests showed failure rates of 50% or higher. Torpedoes still dove too deep, or the wooden fins didn't separate properly, or the gyroscopes failed under the unconventional stresses. But the Japanese were methodical. Each failure was studied. Each variable was isolated and refined. By November 1941, success rates had climbed above 80%. Not perfect, but good enough. The human cost was significant. Several pilots were killed during training accidents. Flying at 40 feet above water, at 170 knots, in a heavily loaded aircraft, while focusing on the perfect release point, required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. The pilots of the first air fleet were the best Japan had. They trained until the attack profile became muscle memory. Drop altitude, approach speed, release point, escape maneuver. Over and over. Thousands of practice runs. They trained in conditions of absolute secrecy. Even most Japanese naval officers didn't know what was being developed. The wooden fins were manufactured in isolated workshops. The modified torpedoes were kept under guard. By late November 1941, 40 specially modified Type 91 torpedoes were loaded aboard the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, the strike force that would attack Pearl Harbor. Each torpedo's wooden fins were carefully inspected. Each pilot knew his exact approach vector, his precise target. They had achieved the impossible. They had created a shallow water torpedo that could function in conditions every expert said were prohibitive. Now they just had to prove it would work when real ships, real lives, and the fate of empires hung in the balance. The Japanese were gambling everything on a wooden fin. American defenders at Pearl Harbor were gambling everything on the assumption that such a weapon couldn't exist. One side would be proven brilliantly right, the other catastrophically wrong. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Oahu's northern coast at 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941. Among them were 40 Nakajima B-5N carrier attack planes, called Kates by the Americans. Each Kate carried one of those precious modified torpedoes slung beneath its belly. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, overall commander of the airstrike, gave the order to attack at 7:53 a.m. His famous signal, Tora, 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 meant tiger, 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 and confirmed complete surprise had been achieved. The torpedo bombers split into 2 groups for what the Japanese called an anvil attack. The first group, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, would attack Battleship Row from the southeast, their torpedoes aimed at the outboard ships. The second group would sweep around Ford Island and attack from the west, targeting ships on the opposite side. At 7:55 a.m., the first Kate began its attack run. The pilot, whose name was never recorded, dropped to 40 feet above the water. His airspeed indicator showed 165 knots. Through his bomb sight, he could see USS Oklahoma, a massive battleship moored outboard of USS Maryland. At exactly the right moment, calculated through hundreds of practice runs, he released his torpedo. The weapon dropped, hit the water with a tremendous splash, and disappeared beneath the surface. On Oklahoma's deck, sailors were just beginning to react to the general quarters alarm. Some thought it was still a drill. Then they felt the impact. The first torpedo struck Oklahoma on her port side at 7:56 a.m. The explosion tore a massive hole in her hull, flooding compartments instantly. Sailors below decks had seconds to react. But the first torpedo was just the beginning. Over the next 8 minutes, 4 more torpedoes slammed into Oklahoma. Each hit opened the ship to the sea. Water poured into her engineering spaces, her magazine compartments, her crew quarters. The battleship's massive weight became her enemy. At 8:08 a.m., just 12 minutes after the first hit, USS Oklahoma began to roll. Over 400 men were still inside. The ship capsized completely, her masts driving into the harbour bottom, her hull pointing toward the sky. Some men escaped through portholes as the ship turned. Others found air pockets and survived for hours before rescue crews could cut through the hull. Many never had a chance. But Oklahoma wasn't the only victim. USS West Virginia, moored outboard of USS Tennessee, was hit by 7 torpedoes in rapid succession. Her captain, Meredith Benyon, was killed by shrapnel while trying to direct damage control efforts. Without his leadership, and with massive flooding overwhelming the ship's pumping capacity, West Virginia settled into the harbour mud. 105 men died aboard West Virginia. But it could have been much worse. Quick thinking by her damage control teams prevented her from capsizing like Oklahoma. They deliberately counter-flooded compartments on the opposite side of the ship, keeping her upright as she sank. USS California took 2 torpedo hits. The first struck at 7:57 a.m., flooding her bow. The second hit minutes later, opening her engineering spaces to the sea. California had one critical vulnerability. Many of her watertight hatches had been opened that morning for an inspection. Water flowed freely through the ship. She sank slowly, settling into the mud over the next 3 days. 100 men died in the attack. The most dramatic moment of the torpedo attack came when USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the raid, tried to escape the harbour. Nevada had taken a single torpedo hit early in the attack, but her crew fought back magnificently. They got steam up, cast off lines, and began moving down the channel toward the harbour entrance. For a brief moment, it looked like she might escape. Japanese pilots saw Nevada moving and immediately shifted their focus. A moving battleship in the narrow channel was too valuable a target to ignore. They swarmed her with bombs and strafed her decks. Realizing that Nevada might sink in the channel and block it completely, American commanders ordered her to beach herself. Nevada ran aground at Hospital Point, her bow crunching into the shoreline, deliberately sacrificed to keep the harbour open. The efficiency of the torpedo attack was terrifying. 40 torpedoes were launched in the first wave. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 33 and 40 hit their targets. That's a hit rate of over 80%, achieved against stationary targets in a surprise attack, but still remarkable. American sailors were experiencing shock beyond comprehension. Men who had survived years at sea, who understood naval warfare, who thought they knew what was possible, watched their world break apart. Chief Water Tender Peter Tomich, aboard USS Utah, stayed at his post, directing the escape of his men as the ship capsized. He was last seen closing watertight doors to prevent flooding from spreading. He went down with his ship. Ensign Thomas Taylor, stationed at the harbour control tower, watched the torpedo wakes cutting through the water and kept repeating, "This can't be happening. The water's too shallow. This can't be happening." But it was happening. The torpedo bombers of the second wave, arriving at 8:54 a.m., found defensive fire had intensified dramatically. American gunners were alert now, angry, and shooting at anything that moved. The Japanese commander made the decision not to send second-wave torpedo bombers into the maelstrom. They had already achieved devastating success. No need to waste more planes and pilots. By 9:45 a.m., when the last Japanese aircraft departed, the toll was clear. 4 battleships had been sunk or capsized by torpedo attacks: Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, and Utah. Arizona had been destroyed by a bomb that penetrated her magazine, but she had also taken torpedo hits. Nevada was beached and damaged. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively destroyed, and the primary weapon wasn't the much-feared armor-piercing bombs. It was torpedoes. Torpedoes that weren't supposed to work. Torpedoes that every expert said were impossible in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. As fires burned and sailors struggled to rescue their trapped shipmates, American naval officers were asking frantic questions. How did the Japanese do this? What technology did they use? How did they overcome the depth problem? The answers would come from the wreckage, from the bodies of ships torn apart by weapons that weren't supposed to exist. And those answers would terrify them even more than the attack itself. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor was chaos. Fires raged across the harbor. Rescue crews worked frantically to cut into capsized hulls, trying to reach men trapped in air pockets. Oil-covered waters burned. The sky was dark with smoke. But even as sailors fought to save their comrades, naval intelligence officers were already searching for answers. Within hours of the attack, salvage divers entered the murky waters of Pearl Harbor. Their primary mission was rescue, but they had secondary orders: recover any Japanese weapons for analysis. What they found shocked them. On the harbor bottom near USS Oklahoma, a diver discovered torpedo fragments, but these weren't ordinary torpedo remains. Attached to the tail section were pieces of wood, splintered, broken wooden structures that appeared to be fins or stabilizers. The diver, confused, brought the fragments to the surface. His report was initially dismissed. Wood? On a torpedo? Someone suggested it was debris from damaged ships. But more divers found more wooden fragments, always near torpedo impact points, always associated with Japanese weapons. Lieutenant Commander Edward Ellsberg, a salvage expert, rushed to Pearl Harbor, examined the fragments personally. He was a brilliant engineer, holder of multiple patents, author of books on naval architecture. He looked at the wooden stabilizer fins and immediately understood their purpose. "My God," he reportedly said. "They solved it. They actually solved it." Within days, Navy engineers had reconstructed the Japanese innovation: the breakaway wooden fins, the low-altitude drop profile. The entire system became clear. An emergency meeting was convened at Pearl Harbor headquarters. Senior naval officers, intelligence personnel, and weapons experts gathered to hear Ellsberg's briefing. His presentation was devastating. The Japanese hadn't violated physics. They had understood it better than American experts. They had identified the key variables, controlling descent rate, impact angle, and depth settings, and engineered solutions for each one. The wooden fins were brilliant in their simplicity. Cheap, easy to manufacture, effective. They turned an impossible weapon into a practical one. But the technical admiration was overshadowed by a more disturbing realization. If the Japanese could innovate like this in torpedo technology, what else had they developed that American intelligence didn't know about? Admiral Chester Nimitz, appointed to command the Pacific Fleet after the attack, ordered a complete review of all assumptions about Japanese capabilities. His directive was blunt: assume nothing. Question everything. The enemy has proven more capable than we believed. The strategic implications were staggering. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a tactical defeat. It revealed a massive intelligence failure. American war planners had underestimated Japanese engineering, training, and innovation. Every harbor in the world suddenly became vulnerable. If shallow water wasn't a defense against torpedoes, where was safe? Naval strategists scrambled to revise defensive doctrines. The British, who had pioneered shallow water torpedo attacks at Taranto, quietly provided their technical data. American engineers studied the British modifications and compared them to Japanese innovations. The Japanese system was superior, more reliable, with a higher success rate. As salvage operations continued through December and into 1942, the full extent of torpedo damage became clear. Divers working inside the sunken battleships found massive holes torn in hull plating. Some ruptures were 20 feet across. The explosive force had been tremendous. Oklahoma had taken 5 torpedo hits. The combined flooding overwhelmed her pumping capacity in minutes. She never had a chance. West Virginia had been hit 7 times. 7 separate holes in her hull, each one potentially fatal. That she settled upright instead of capsizing was only due to brilliant damage control by her crew. The human cost was appalling. Of the 2,400, 3 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor, a significant majority died on ships hit by torpedoes. Men trapped in flooded compartments. Sailors crushed by collapsing bulkheads. Engineers drowned at their posts. Rescue crews cutting into Oklahoma's hull found air pockets where men had survived for days, breathing stale air, waiting for rescue in complete darkness. Some were saved. Others died just hours before rescuers reached them. The salvage of Oklahoma took years. She was eventually righted, refloated, and sold for scrap. But she never fought again. Her war ended in the first 12 minutes. California was refloated, repaired, and returned to service. She would fight in multiple battles, earning 7 battle stars. But 100 men who served aboard her on December 7th never saw those victories. West Virginia was salvaged, rebuilt with modern fire control systems, and returned to action. She participated in the Battle of Surigao Strait, the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. In a poetic justice, she helped destroy Japanese warships with her main guns. But the ships could be salvaged. The men could not. Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger, who had warned of Pearl Harbor's vulnerability to air attack in a March 1941 report, was asked about the torpedo attacks. His response was haunting. We knew air attack was possible. We knew bombing was a threat. We never imagined they could solve the torpedo problem. We thought physics was on our side. We were wrong. Japanese engineers, after the war, confirmed the development timeline. The shallow water torpedo program had cost the equivalent of millions of dollars, involved hundreds of engineers and technicians, and required absolute priority for resources Japan could barely afford. But Admiral Yamamoto had insisted, make it work, no matter the cost. It worked. And it nearly knocked America out of the Pacific War before it truly began. The question American officers kept asking was this: if we had known the attack was coming, if we had been on full alert, would it have mattered? The honest answer was sobering. Probably not. The torpedo attack was so swift, so overwhelming, that even fully alert defences couldn't have stopped enough torpedoes to save the battle line. The Japanese had achieved tactical perfection. They had trained obsessively. They had attacked with precision. And they had used a weapon that American defenders literally believed couldn't harm them. It was the most complete surprise attack in modern military history, and it was built on a foundation of wooden fins and American overconfidence. The shallow water torpedo attack on Pearl Harbor changed naval warfare forever. Within months, every navy in the world revised their harbor defense protocols. The assumption that depth provided protection was dead. Torpedo nets, previously considered unnecessary in shallow ports, became mandatory. So the SCAs, Proskasten, and slash anti-aircraft defences around harbours were tripled. Combat air patrols became standard procedure. The age of the vulnerable anchored fleet was over. But the changes went deeper than tactics. The Pearl Harbor attack forced a fundamental shift in how Western powers viewed Japanese military capability. Before December 7th, 1941, American military planners often dismissed Japanese technology as derivative or inferior. Japanese equipment was seen as copied from Western designs, produced with lower quality, operated by poorly trained personnel. Pearl Harbor shattered those racist assumptions. The shallow water torpedo was a Japanese innovation, superior to anything Western navies had developed. The attack coordination was flawless. The training was superb. American forces had been defeated by a better prepared, more innovative enemy. This realization changed American strategy. The military stopped underestimating Japanese capabilities. Intelligence efforts intensified. Respect for the enemy, grudging but real, replaced dismissive confidence. Ironically, the very success of the Pearl Harbor attack may have contributed to Japan's ultimate defeat. The shock to American public opinion was so profound, the desire for revenge so overwhelming, that any possibility of a negotiated peace evaporated. Japan had united America against them with perfect efficiency. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor Plan, reportedly said after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said those exact words is debated by historians, but the sentiment was accurate. The shallow water torpedo gave Japan a stunning tactical victory. But strategic victory required knocking America out of the war completely. That didn't happen. The aircraft carriers, the primary target, weren't in harbour that day. The fuel storage facilities, which could have crippled Pearl Harbor for years, weren't destroyed. The repair facilities survived intact. Within 6 months, American industrial might was producing warships at a rate Japan couldn't match. Within a year, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. By 1945, American forces would destroy the Japanese fleet using many of the same tactical innovations, including improved aerial torpedoes. The legacy of Pearl Harbor's torpedo attack lives in multiple forms. Every modern torpedo incorporates lessons learned from that development program. The concept of modifying weapons for specific attack scenarios became standard practice. Post-war interviews with Japanese engineers revealed the extent of their innovation. They had tested over 50 different wooden fin configurations. They had analysed the wood grain at microscopic levels to find the optimal failure point. They had calculated entry angles to within fractions of a degree. One Japanese engineer, speaking decades later, said, "We didn't have America's resources. The second, we have the sea. We couldn't outproduce them, so we had to outthink them. For a brief moment, we did. It wasn't enough to win the war, but it proved that innovation matters more than size. The Americans learned that lesson painfully. The post-war US Navy became obsessed with technological superiority. Never again would they assume an enemy couldn't innovate. Never again would they dismiss an adversary's capabilities. Modern naval warfare doctrine still references Pearl Harbor when discussing surprise attacks and weapon innovation. The attack is studied at every naval academy in the world, not just for the tactical execution, but for what it reveals about the dangers of overconfidence. The shallow water torpedo also highlights a deeper truth about warfare: assumptions kill. The US Navy's assumption that Pearl Harbor was torpedo-proof led directly to the deaths of thousands of sailors. The assumption was based on good science, solid engineering, and conventional wisdom. It was also completely wrong. 7:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941. Ensign Tausig watches that first torpedo wake and shouts, "Impossible!" 12 minutes later, USS Oklahoma capsizes, carrying 400 men to their deaths. The impossible had happened. Physics hadn't changed. Understanding had. The final statistics remained staggering. 40 torpedoes launched, 33 to 40 hits, 4 battleships sunk or capsized, nearly 1,500 men killed by torpedo attacks alone, all achieved with a weapon that every American expert said couldn't work in those waters. A post-war naval intelligence report included a quote from an unidentified Japanese torpedo bomber pilot captured in 1944. When asked about the Pearl Harbor attack, he said, "We trained for a year. We practiced until the attack run was automatic. We knew the Americans believed torpedoes couldn't function in shallow water. We knew they were wrong. On that morning, we didn't defy physics. We just understood it better than they did." That statement captures the essence of Pearl Harbor's torpedo attack. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was engineering, training, and determination, combined with enemy overconfidence. The wooden fins that made it possible were almost absurdly simple. Pieces of cypress wood, carefully shaped, attached with breakaway pins. Technology that seems primitive compared to modern guided munitions. But in December 1941, those wooden fins were the most sophisticated torpedo innovation in the world. They were the difference between an impossible attack and a devastating reality. The Americans laughed at the idea of shallow water torpedoes. They dismissed the threat. They anchored their fleet in neat rows, confident that nature itself protected them. They stopped laughing when the first explosion tore through Oklahoma's hull. By the time the attack ended, laughter had turned to horror, confidence to desperate re-evaluation. The Pacific War would rage for nearly 4 more years. Millions would die. Entire cities would burn. The atomic age would dawn in mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it all began with wooden fins and American overconfidence, with Japanese innovation and Western dismissiveness. With the moment the impossible became real and the world changed forever. Those torpedo wakes cutting through Pearl Harbor's shallow waters on December 7th, 1941, weren't just weapons of war. They were lessons in humility, written in steel and blood, and the bodies of ships that were supposed to be safe. The lesson remains relevant today. Never underestimate an enemy's ability to innovate. Never assume that impossible means won't happen. Never let confidence become arrogance. Because somewhere, someone is working on a wooden fin. A simple solution to an impossible problem. An innovation that will turn your certainties into casualties. The Japanese proved it could be done. Pearl Harbor paid the price for American disbelief. And the shallow waters of that December morning still whisper a warning to every generation. Respect your enemy's ambition. Question your assumptions. And never, ever laugh at the impossible. Because the impossible just might kill you.